Welcome to Cultivated Live for Friday, March 1st, 2024. I'm Jay Rosenthal. I'm the co-founder of Cultivated Media and the host of Cultivated Live, which we're doing here right now. And since we launched, our goal at Cultivated has been to be reader first, providing the cannabis industry with the most important, insightful, and useful information to our audience. And until now, or until last week, that was almost entirely done through our daily newsletter called Cultivated Daily. And while we certainly would love for you to subscribe to that daily newsletter, and thank you if you already have, we also want to meet the industry where you are. And many of you are on LinkedIn and YouTube. And so we thought we would do a daily live stream and add that to the mix. Here's what we do. We run down the most important stories of the day. Often we have a guest, just not on Fridays. And then we get to interview our guests and learn more about their slice of the sector or insight they can share. And so with that, we'll get to the news of this day, Friday, March 1st. A new study on how cannabis affects heart health paints a troubling picture, but the study's design deserves some skepticism. Now, frequent cannabis use is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular and other health conditions, including heart attacks and strokes. And daily cannabis use can increase the rate of heart attacks by 25% and strokes by 42%, according to the study published in the Journal of American Heart Association. When controlling for tobacco use, daily cannabis use increased the risk of heart attacks by 50% and doubled the risk of strokes. Even less frequent cannabis users, those that reported weekly use, showed an increase in heart attack and strokes. The study's authors looked at self-reported data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey for adults between the ages of 18 and 74. 75% of survey respondents said smoking, importantly, was their primary consumption method. But studies of these nature are observational, and they have clear limitations on their applications, and they're not causal. In simple English, as we described in our newsletter today, that means that while there is a clear correlation between frequent cannabis use and heart attacks based on the survey data, the authors have not specifically found a mechanism in cannabis that actually causes these effects. So it's unclear what's really causing the uptick, as these studies are mostly unreliable in determining causation. Amanda Ryman, for her part, a social scientist and an expert on cannabis-related issues, told Jeremy Burke, who is our editor-in-chief here at Cultivated, that studies such as this one should ask more relevant and nuanced questions about consumption methods in order to help consumers make more informed decisions and disentangle the effects of smoking versus other methods. Peter Grinspoon, for his part, a doctor and an expert on medical applications of cannabis, pointed out on X, formerly Twitter, that the authors didn't consider that cannabis users may have been sicker in the first place and that they used cannabis to self-medicate their symptoms. All the experts agreed that much more research is needed to help inform consumers and policymakers. Now, the study got picked up in various outlets, including CNN and the New York Times, among other places, and much of the breathless coverage around the study clearly conflates the correlation and causation problem and does both cannabis consumers and policymakers studying the issue a disservice without the proper context that I think I just gave you. But still, this is the latest broad observational study to point to the fact that daily cannabis use might not be good for your heart, especially if you consume it smoking. Similarly, American Heart Association 2020 issued a public statement over the risks of cannabis use and cardiovascular health. So we will keep an eye on this, both as an issue, but also the repercussions as it's talked about in the broader public. Former Colorado Representative Ed Perlmutter has some things on his mind when it comes to safe banking and rescheduling. He said, and this is a quote, "I think there are lots of folks that want it, and it is safe banking, done. The problem is just that Congress has got to start functioning in a better way, and I hold out hope for that," and that's the end of the quote. Note that Perlmutter is now lobbying for the bill on behalf of the National Cannabis Roundtable, which is an industry trade group. Now, did you know that 54% of Americans live in a state where recreational cannabis use is legal, according to a new study from Pew Research? Beyond that, 74% of Americans live in a state where medical or recreational cannabis use is legal. So the tide is turning, as they say. And here's why it matters. 3/4 of Americans live in states with some form of legalized cannabis. And we think it's time for the federal government to catch up, and Ed Perlmutter agrees. Now, right now, the ball is firmly in the Drug Enforcement Administration's court as to the decision about rescheduling or perhaps removing cannabis from the list of federally controlled substances entirely and regulating it much more like alcohol. Now, here's something that was also in this research. There are nearly 15,000 dispensaries in the US, and this is interesting. 79% of Americans live in a county with at least one cannabis dispensary, and we think that's pretty cool. Now, a couple of quick hits to get you on your way. Housing Works Cannabis Company, one of the first legal dispensary operators in New York, announced today that they will set up 5 new dispensaries as part of the state's conditional adult use retail dispensary, the CARD license program. To Delaware, they have released draft rules for regulating the sale of cannabis within the very small state of Delaware, but also the home state of President Joe Biden. And Vancouver-based cannabis software startup Elevated Signals raised just under $6 million US in a round led by Yaletown Partners. Now, the startup is well known for their cannabis technology, but also they're going into vertical farming and mining. There's more on that in our newsletter today. Cannabis firm MariMed has released a new line of flavors for its Vibations line of cannabis-infused electrolyte drink mixes. So check that out. And New York cannabis company Etain is set to open a dispensary in White Plains later today. Now, next week, we have a very big week on Cultivated Live. Monday, we'll have Mike Barenboim. He is the CEO of Weed Gets. So we'll talk to a CEO of a cannabis technology company for consumers. Tuesday, we'll be back with Brad Spirison of Grown In for our podcast, United States of Cannabis. And we will have 2, not 1, but 2 New Hampshire state representatives that are leading the charge for legalization in that state, and 1 former state rep as well to talk about it. On Wednesday, my co-founder Jeremy will be with us to talk about all things cannabis that's in the news, but specifically we'll touch on whether we think the president will or will not talk about cannabis in the State of the Union, which is next Thursday. And then on Thursday, we'll be joined again by Krista Raymer from Vitrina, again talking about cannabis retail. Now, if you missed the show yesterday, she joined us to take a deep and thoughtful look at discounting in cannabis dispensaries and how retailers ought to be thinking about discounting and sort of the metrics to look at to see if it is successful or not. And that is all for today's Cultivated Live. We encourage you to subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. It's right here. Follow us on LinkedIn and smash the subscribe button on YouTube if you're watching us there. We'll be back here Monday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern, with Cultivated Live, again, talking with a cannabis tech CEO. Have a great weekend, everybody. And remember, buy from your local dispensary today.